to them. So factor myth, based on that information that we see that a lot of patients have about clinical trials. So factor myth, if I enter clinical trials, a good chance that I would receive a placebo, and that's a myth, especially in myeloma, that placebos are rarely and really not used in cancer clinical trials anymore. If you have cancer, they can't randomize you to no therapy at all. That would be that would never get past the FDA or any institutional review board. Placebos are rarely used. Again, randomized clinical trials are best current care, the best care that is currently available, the standard of care, versus the treatment arm is the best available care plus the investigational agent. So there are no placebos that are given. Clinical trials are riskier than FDA-approved drugs, and that's also a myth. The treatment on clinical trials has a good chance of success because it has passed all of those safeguards to make sure that it is effective and safe for patients. And the drugs that are approved by the FDA all started at clinical trials, and they were found to be safe at that point. Clinical trials, the trial itself is more important than the patient, an absolute myth. And to me, I encourage patients to go in clinical trials because they are the most important part of the clinical trials, and that you can stop a clinical trial participation at any time for any reason without any repercussions at all. And so if you say, gosh, this clinical trial isn't for me, from the time you sign to the very end of the study, you can always opt out of the clinical trial with absolutely no repercussions. You are really the star of the clinical trial. If my doctor doesn't mention clinical trials, it must not be right for me. And that is also a myth. The fact of the matter is that your doctor may not be aware of the clinical trials that are available for you. And so it's really important, especially being on education forums like this, to be able to find the clinical trial, especially if you have multiple myeloma. Clinical trials are available only for people that have advanced cancer, and that is also a myth. Clinical trials for myeloma are now available for patients at every stage of disease. There are MGUS trials. There are pre-MGUS trials. There are 76 smoldering myeloma trials that are ongoing right now. There are multiple newly diagnosed trials for patients in maintenance, transplant trials. The wealth of clinical trials in myeloma is now vast and not just relegated to patients with advanced cancer. Clinical trial drugs cost too much money. That's a myth, because the actual drugs used in those clinical trials are covered by the trial sponsor, and all other costs are usually covered by the insurance, especially if they aren't directly related to the clinical trial. So there's no increase in cost accrued by being on a clinical trial. And the biggest one, if I enter a clinical trial, I'll be a guinea pig, and that's a myth. The clinical trials provide the best available therapy for a patient, and possibly an even better therapy for patients. And I guess I would say, one important thing that's specific about myeloma is that the myeloma space, you've heard so many good things and so many breakthroughs in myeloma. The myeloma space has become incredibly competitive. So only the best drugs actually make it to the clinical trials because there are so many good things happening in myeloma. 15, 20 years ago, when there were only 3 or 4 drugs for myeloma, we were trying lots of new things for myeloma. Now that we have a wealth of different therapies for myeloma, it has become very competitive, which is good for patients.